Hello, I am Brad West, an Australian sociologist who researches on war and the military as they relate to national identity, social change and security. In this video, I examine the broad ethical issues related to the Australian Defence Force's increased utilisation of industry. The discussion will be informed by research in the academic field of armed forces and society, as well as drawing on sociological theory that considers the values and moral codes that operate in different spheres within contemporary society. In particular, I will outline the variety of ways that an environment for unethical conduct can unintentionally emerge from an unrefined application of market and quasi-market-type logics to the military. Some of these concerns are well established, others less frequently considered, and have emerged only in recent years. In making this case, I do not in any way suggest that industry is not critical to Australia's defence capability moving forward. The shift in technological expertise at the end of the Cold War from the public to the private sector means that there is no return to a military that has a high level of autonomy from industry. A new industry-military relationship certainly needs to be formed, particularly given the increasing role of technology in warfare. Indeed, some of my current research has been on how better relationships of trust can be formed between the military and the defence industry. However, in this video I argue that the military-industry relationship is one that has to be carefully managed, that the differences in culture between the two spheres need to be recognised and respected to avoid a potential escalation in unethical behaviour and an erosion of cultural identifiers that play an important role in maintaining ethical standards. From one perspective, questions around the use of industry in support of military power are somewhat philosophical, part of long-standing debates about the appropriate relationship between civilian society and the military. It is a topic that at least dates to Plato, who in his best-known thesis, The Republic, asks, who should guard our guardians, and what is the best means by which to ensure the loyalty of those to whom we authorise the use of violence? Though what makes the issue also an important sociological topic is that the military-industry relationship is thoroughly a contemporary one. It is both a manifestation of current social, political and economic forces, and consequential for what sociologists term social structure, referring to the institutional arrangements as well as the social norms and values that influence the ways in which human beings interact and live together. The defence industry as we know it today is surprisingly rather a recent development. In the first half of the 20th century, military-industry relations were less problematic. While conflict saw significant increases in women in workplaces, something that would be critical to the war effort, World War I saw largely government-owned industries redirected to military mobilisation, and World War II involved nation-based sovereign civilian industries willingly mobilised, later returning to their primary civilian mission. In contrast, the Cold War saw the emergence of a dedicated defence-orientated industry, fueled by the seemingly constant and reliable sources of funding for technological development and arms manufacturing. This occurred simultaneously with the emergence of large-standing militaries and new military identities that occurred through a rather rapid professionalisation of the armed forces. The most prominent ethical issues that derive from this development revolves around the idea of a military-industrial complex. While this term is widely used in social science analysis, this famous characterisation of the relationship between military and industry was coined by the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, formerly a five-star general during World War II. In his farewell address, he had a clear warning in regards to military-industry relations.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new. We recognize the imperative need for this development. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
A biographer of Eisenhower claims that in an earlier draft of the speech, the phrase used was military-industrial congressional complex, pointing to the critical role US politicians play in this formulation. Eisenhower's comments have over the years often been used to suggest a conspiratorial-like relationship between military and the industry. Most recently, in late 2020, then US President Donald Trump suggested that the reason he might not have the support of those in the Pentagon was because, quote, they want to do nothing but fight wars so that all of those wonderful companies that make the bombs, that make the planes and everything else stay happy. The relationship is much more complex. It is not clear what exact level of complexity Eisenhower appreciated in warning of the military-industrial complex, but his speech did echo the concerns of prominent sociologists at the time about the dangers of new emerging connections between the military, industry and politics. The well-known sociologist C. Wright Mills, for example, in one of his most famous works, feared a power elite was emerging from the Cold War, breaking down professional boundaries that had previously seen the military retain an independence from capitalist culture and political influence. Mills believed the boundaries between these groups and their different cultural traits and traditions had played an important role in maintaining a check against the excesses of any one group. Concern about how the military could be influenced by other societal spheres was also a central issue for Samuel Huntington, as outlined in his famous book, The Soldier in the State, what has become an important text in military officer education. Huntington was essentially concerned with the ways in which too much exposure and connections between the military and civilian society could negatively affect capability by diluting what he terms the military mind, something which he characterised as necessarily being somewhat conservative, realistic, and historically inclined. For Huntington, this conservatism is functional as it avoids the self-interest and short-term political trends of the contemporary age, providing personnel in the armed forces with a resolve and a commitment to military life in a way that warns off the attractiveness of higher salaries and better conditions in civilian employment, while also embedding the values of duty, service and sacrifice required for an effective military during times of war. Contemporary social science research on the military-industrial complex has validated many of Eisenhower's original concerns about the vested interests of profit from the defence industry. Studies have exposed the influence attained through political contributions made by the defence industry, how lobbying techniques can encourage increases in military spending, the use of gifts and bribes to influence contracts, how political interest sees the defence industry subject to a relatively low level of regulatory oversight, and how the formation of elite networks forms across the military, defence industry and politics in a way that creates conflicts of interest and corruption that adversely affect the free market mechanisms espoused by those arguing that the private sector can do jobs more effectively than the public sector. Questions of how markets operate and what role should the public sector play are particularly important for Australia, given so much of our current security strategy surrounds establishing a sovereign defence industry. Despite such research, there are many unknowns about the military-industrial complex today. This has been exacerbated by social science analysis moving away from the broader questions of defence-industry relations, as raised by C. Wright Mills and Samuel Huntington. While the military as an institution is frequently critiqued by academics, this largely is orientated to the problems with military professionalism as it emerges from an oversubscription to traditional notions of the military mind, rather than a concern focused on any civilianising of the military. However, the military-industrial complex today, following the military reinvestment in spending since 9/11, and now tensions between the West, with China as well as Russia, are significant, particularly if placed in the context of transformations to the defence industry since the end of the Cold War. Between 1989 and 1996, defence spending fell suddenly and significantly, estimated to have reduced by a third in real terms. Consequently, the sector witnessed a dramatic wave of takeovers and mergers, with it now dominated by a limited number of large corporations known as defence primes. Increased concentration in the sector happened jointly with the multinationalising process by which remaining firms now have no single national base. In search of profits and viability, Western defence industries were also allowed to undertake arms trade with countries that once regulation forbid. Without the security of the Cold War funding environment, the defence industry also diversified across industries, blurring their identity as well as resulting in the potential for conflict of interest. The majority of what we know about the contemporary military-industrial complex today is also either related to the United States or focuses on military corruption in developing nations. We need much more attention on the Australian context, particularly as, like elsewhere, unethical behaviour in the sector is often not the subject of political inquiry or is covered up out of fear that it could spoil military-industry relations in ways that make the nation or states a less attractive place for defence industry business, compromising jobs and tax revenue, or alternatively rationalised as being detrimental to the country's defence preparedness. However, we do know that unethical environments are ultimately detrimental to defence capability. While corruption is found in all societal spheres, the arms industry is internationally generally thought to be amongst the most vulnerable to corrupt behaviour. In part, this is due to the monetary value of the contracts at stake, and as a global industry it now includes trade with countries in which corruption is widespread and an accepted aspect of doing business. Cases of large-scale corruption continue to be reported and recorded across the defence industry. This is not only at the level of elites, but also relates to the outsourcing of more mundane roles previously undertaken by those in uniform. One international example of this type of practice is the Fat Leonard scandal, stemming from corrupt port services contracts for the US Navy's Pacific operations. The scandal related to Glenn Defence Marine Asia, GDMA, a contractor based in Singapore, which provided a variety of services such as meals to tugboat services to the US 7th Fleet. It found that officers, enlisted personnel, and civilian employees provided confidential information on ship movements that would be used to steer Navy ships towards harbours that offered a higher profit margin to GDMA. No such equivalent scandal has occurred in Australia, but we would be ignorant to think that it could not. Certainly, the various inquiries that have been undertaken into our major defence procurement projects have shown that we have generally weak codes of ethics around conflicts of interest. The potential for such conflicts is evident in the Department of Defence and military personnel frequently taking jobs with defence industry firms within days or weeks of leaving their government-paid posts. This includes senior government officials taking up well-paid positions that involve lobbying their former colleagues. We are also seeing an unprecedented outsourcing of jobs from the ADF to the private sector that were once undertaken by those in uniform. While the majority of these are in areas of relatively mundane service provision, it also includes professionals with expertise in short supply within the Australian job market. According to the 2010 Defence Census, there are 6,567 contractors, people engaged by Defence under a contract for skills that would normally be maintained in the Australian Public Service or Australian Defence Force workforce, to perform day-to-day duties of defence. These are people working above the line, meaning working on behalf of the Commonwealth to run projects and activities, as opposed to those working below the line, delivering services and products to those projects. According to Marcus Hellyer, Australian Strategic Policies Institute's Senior Analyst for Defence Economics and Capability, this outsourcing and rampant shift of personnel from military service to private enterprise is only likely to rise as the government increases its acquisitions in the area of defence, something likely to create a labour shortage for the military, as the private sector can more easily respond to those conditions with higher salaries and better conditions. In this scenario, there is a significant danger that decisions made by individuals while in the military or in the Department of Defence are through a prism of ultimately wanting to move into the defence industry, although the interests of the two do not always align. Apart from the increased use of industry in support of military power creating economic rewards and conflicts, following Huntington, it can be argued that we should also be concerned with how the embrace of market logics by defence might be affecting military professional identity, typically thought of as a safeguard against ethical breaches. For example, the growth of outsourcing changes the composition of the military in a way that also has an important effect on its culture. The removal of such roles as cooks and engineers from the ranks, for example, makes a significant effect on the ways in which those in uniform comprehend their service. Arguably, it can create conditions that breed a warrior culture, the like of which the Brereton Report saw as being influential in the alleged committing of war crimes by Australian Defence Force personnel in the Afghanistan conflict. While the alleged actions are of a different order than the type of unethical behaviour we are generally talking about in relation to the use of industry to support military power, the report does discuss how the alleged atrocities came about through the sanctioning of more minor lapses in ethical behaviour and rule breaking, something that could potentially occur in an environment in which traditional military and bureaucratic identities is seen as in need of reform and requiring the influence of market logics and enterprise culture. Particularly significant in thinking about the role of market logics and military professional identity in Australia is the influential 2015 First Principles Review and its argument for a one defence model. Effectively, that a more efficient and agile system requires greater levels of integration and streamlining across the military, public service and industry. The review largely focuses on reform as it relates to defence procurement, and I should note that the review panel chair has emphasised in various forums the report relates to the business of defence rather than the military operations of defence. However, the logics and conclusions of the review, I argue, have been more broadly applied to operational reform and military organisation, as seen in Australia's 2016 Defence White Paper, the 2020 Force Structure Plan, and the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, amongst other documents. This is not problematic in itself, but such a shift emerges from a critique of traditional military professionalism, typically casting it as being inefficient and slow. The First Principles Review, significantly, saw this as an inherent quality of any non-commercial approach. The history of defence itself is cast in negative terms as being perpetually change-resistant, with the only solution to this being an unshackling of tradition and an embracing of market logics. Often using highly value-laden binary contrasts, the review argues that the only way in which Australia can achieve the required level of technological superiority to protect itself is for defence to enthusiastically adopt a culture that champions individual enterprise. In doing so, the First Principles Review effectively casts established military professionalism as an inherent impediment to capability. Such strategic arguments for the need for wide-ranging reforms towards enterprise and the inherent good of change are not new. The late 20th century similarly saw new management strategies widely applied to the public sector and government administration, though with often problematic consequences for ethical behaviour and in many cases to the detriment of long-term performance and efficiency levels. As such, we need to be careful in how reform ideology is applied to defence, avoiding a totalising view that sees anything that differs from pure entrepreneurialism as an outdated bureaucratic tradition. To do so fails to appreciate that there are many values that make the military and public service different to that of business, and that this can have potential adverse consequences for organisational culture and ethics. Metaphorically, it can result in throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There are various examples of this cultural shift in the military where free market-based logics are influential in what it means to serve in the ADF. A recent change to the description of defence values now sees the testament that, to live out our values, military personnel now must be adaptable, innovative and agile. Another example is that the defence industry is now portrayed not simply as a provider to defence, but as a partner. In wanting to attract veterans to the industry, the defence industry, as well as governments, have often promoted the idea that the defence industry is an arena in which veterans can continue to contribute to their nation's defence. The public relations officers of defence primes have also been profiling the military service of their employees, promoting such sentiments. Those veterans in senior management roles of defence primes in Australia are often eager to emphasise that their prior military service, or in some cases their continuing role as reservists, means that they are not primarily motivated by profits. The rhetorical influence of the One Defence model is also evident in the defence media, establishing and promoting awards that span the ADF, defence industry, Australian public service and academia, each competing with each other for the same awards. While the awards are supposed to be about defence business, in many cases the description of the good work done within the Australian Defence Force is not clearly restricted to this area of business and innovation, but goes to the core role of Australian Defence Force personnel. Attempts have been made to naturalise the close connections between the military and the defence industry through remembrance of the role of industry in past conflicts. This includes the Australian War Memorial profiling certain defence industry primes and other companies, often as part of their industry sponsorship of the institution. The ethical issues with this association between defence industry and service is twofold. Firstly, it can draw attention away from issues of sovereignty, that the interests of multinational companies will not necessarily align with that of the nation. Australian industry is not necessarily industry working in Australia. Control of defence primes is elsewhere, and corporate decisions are ultimately made offshore. Logically, international corporations, and corporations more generally, will prioritise their own requirements when faced with competing interests. This might even be mandated upon them by national allies of Australia, particularly if there's a fear of losing intellectual property to adversaries. It is such issues that has seen controversy arise over the effectiveness of Australia's Industry Capability Program. Critics, including the Australian Industry and Defence Network, AIDEN, Australia's peak national industry body representing mostly small to medium businesses operating in the defence industry, demand an urgent review of the Australian Industry Capability Program, citing concerns it is not meeting its objectives in providing sufficient opportunities for local industries. Secondly, ethical issues derive from symbolically connecting corporations with military service, in that the corporation's actions can spoil and sour the important notions of service and duty that underpin the effectiveness of militaries. Simply, it would be unrealistic to expect companies to abide by the same types of moral codes or the military covenant that national militaries are expected to do in relation to its members. Yet the two are being tied together in ways whereby the sacredness of service is potentially lessened in the process. Drawn from my research on transition and employment of veterans, consider this ex-soldier's account of seeing sponsorship in the Australian War Memorial from a company who he had previously worked and feels that he was unfairly dismissed due to service-related mental health conditions.
To give you an example of the sort of thing that really upsets me, last year I went to Canberra for my 30th reunion of our graduation from the Defence Academy, and basically we had a cocktail party at the war memorial. And as you go wandering around the memorial, you see all of the big corporate sponsors. And one of them was, well, we thank X for supporting Australia's veterans. And I had a very visceral response to it. I wanted to rip it off the wall because I feel the war memorial is my place. It's my safe space, and it belongs to every other veteran. Okay, and sure, they gave money, but these people who treated me so badly at a time when I needed support, which I asked for, and asked for, and asked for, but didn't receive, I felt that invaded my safe place. The place for veterans and I, like for all, that they had forced their way in, and even there, I couldn't get away from them. And still now, I feel bitterness and resentment.
Based on my interviews with veterans on their transition experiences, I would argue a key difficulty for many veterans is the loss of life purpose that comes from now working for a profit-motivated company, compared with the military that has higher ideals. If working in the defence industry is seen as part of defence service, this ultimately will take away from the distinctive values of what it has traditionally meant to serve. So while the defence industry is often made up of a large percentage of veterans, and through its public relations campaigns champions the military life, in other ways, through advocating for a managerialist critique of the military bureaucracy as being inefficient, it is also simultaneously undermining traditional military professional identity. This is significant as scholarship on unethical behaviour has emphasised the difficulty in addressing the problem of ethics and corruption through regulation and codes of conduct alone, with organisational culture being the most significant influencer of behaviour. As such, reduced levels of attachment and trust between military personnel and the Australian Defence Force can be a key enabler of unethical behaviour. For example, this can be seen when individuals rationalise unethical behaviour by thinking that benefits attained are somehow owed to them, it being some kind of compensation, or justified as being common practice or consistent with the unstated rules of the workplace. I will complete my discussion by reflecting on the ethics that surrounds the use of private security contractors. In this controversial area, we do not see the championing of Australia's engagement with the private sector in the way we do with procurement. Private security contractors have been the subject of significant ethical debates regarding the rules and norms that govern the application of lethal force in armed conflict. The Nisour Square massacre on September 16, 2007 has been a significant object of these debates. This involved employees of Blackwater Security Consulting, a private military company contracted by the US government to provide security services in Iraq, shooting Iraqi civilians, killing 17 and injuring 20 in Baghdad. Despite such debates, our comprehension of the ethical issues of private security have been limited by a dearth of research on who these military contractors are and the factors that see them join the industry. It is a mistake to simply view this group as traditional mercenaries, given their now mainstream use, employed largely by governments. During certain stages of the recent Iraq and Afghanistan wars, a Congressional Research Service report estimated that private contractors employed by the United States constituted about half of the boots on the ground. While the nature of Australia's role in the Middle East operations did not see it employ military contractors in the same way or level, the Australian government widely uses them to protect Australians and national assets abroad. The industry also sees an active involvement by ex-Australian Defence Force personnel, with it being reported that Australian military veterans are overrepresented at the upper levels of management in many of the world's private security companies. Despite its growth, this billion-dollar industry is largely unregulated. This is not surprising, as one of the main reasons that Western nations employ private security companies is to outsource political risk. This is in part related to the public's greater intolerance for casualties amongst its armed forces, but also creates a cushion against diplomatic controversies. For example, a recent New York Times article examines how American military contractors imprisoned abroad, frequently on trumped-up charges and convicted without due legal process, do not see their cases create the sort of political concern and diplomatic urgency that would have been the case if they were in uniform rather than indirectly employed by the nation. This is a risk known by military contractors, and the reason it can be financially lucrative for them to undertake this work. But such weak loyalties have created a whole new class of warrior that lacks the moral bonds between the military and those serving it. The consequences here are not only to military identity, but potentially society more broadly, given that scholars, such as the classical sociologist Max Weber, have argued that the citizen-soldier model and the egalitarian notions of sacrifice associated with it, particularly as it emerged in World War I, brought with it the modern democratic ideal of citizenship. While there is much research needed on the characteristics of armed private security contractors, we do know that these firms are largely made up of ex-military, and they often move directly into the industry from military service. My colleague Thomas Crosby has found in his research into American contractors that they tend to be from places with limited economic prospects, and this work is generally undertaken on a short-term basis. As such, the ethics of military contractors cannot be divorced from those surrounding veteran transition and welfare more broadly. With high levels of veteran unemployment in Australia, and well-publicised inadequacies in transition and veteran services, the danger is that veterans see security contracting as their only viable employment option upon discharge. This is despite there being a high potential for this work to create or further physical and mental health problems. In my research on veteran well-being, I have come across accounts where veterans have felt that transition services actively encouraged and pushed them into the security sector, something that was highly detrimental to their existing post-traumatic stress. In this regard, a 2013 RAND study of over 600 international private security contractors operating in theatres of conflict between 2011 and 2013 found that 25% screened positive for post-traumatic stress disorder, including many which were still actively deployed. While the number of defence contractors employed by Western militaries has declined significantly since the peak of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, there are new ethical concerns relating to the displacement of these workers and what contracts such companies may seek in a world in which Australia's competitors and adversaries are engaged in various forms of grey zone conflict. To conclude, the technological expertise in the private sector means that defence capability is now closely aligned with military-industry relations. However, there is a danger that a fertile environment for unethical behaviour can come about by over-enthusiastically applying market logics to the military in ways that fail to retain both real and symbolic distinctions between the military and industry. These ethical considerations are not only at the level of individual decision-making, such as that relating to financial inducements or military personnel trying to enhance their future employment prospects in the private sector in ways that work against the public interest. But also, if we fail to protect the distinctive values and moral codes that define military life and encourage a view of it as a vocation, there can be, in President Eisenhower's words, consequences for the very structure of our society. The main point here is not that market logics are in themselves problematic, or that the defence industry does not have its own values and ethics. Rather, that society is made up of various spheres, and each is underpinned by a different sort of morality and identity, and that there can be adverse ethical consequences if we do not recognise and respect the power of these distinctions.